Okay, we're carrying on with our discussion of Hume and the problem of induction. Now, in part one of section 4 of the inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume has tried to prove to us a couple of theses. First of all, he wanted to prove to us that we only know unobserved matters of fact because we know the causal relationship between those unobserved facts and things that we are currently observing or remember. But then he wanted to ask, how do we know what the causal relationships between any facts are? And he says we can't know those without previous observation of similar cases. We can't know them a priori. We only know the causal relationships between facts based on past experience of similar cases. Now, that's where we're picking up the thread right now. In part two, he wants to ask a further question. Even after I have experienced instances of a certain kind of causal relationship, how do I know that the same causal relationship holds true in other instances? For example, how do I know that this gunpowder keg is going to blow up just because the last 100 that I lit blew up? Why do I believe that the same causes will have the same effects and vice versa? That's the question. What evidence do I have for that? And Hume's answer, and this is where the skepticism comes in, Hume's answer is going to be that we don't know that on the basis of any possible argument whatsoever. There is no good argument at all that can convince us that causal relationships that we have not yet observed are going to be the same as the causal relationships that we have observed. For all we know by any possible argument, the next gunpowder keg will not blow up, even though it's the exact identical case as the ones that we've observed previously. That is the stunning skeptical conclusion. Now, how does he get there? He's going to do this in phases. First, he's going to argue that there is no demonstrative reasoning that could convince us that the same causal relationships will hold. And then he's going to show us that there's no what he calls moral, or we would call probabilistic reasoning that can convince us that the same causal relationships hold in observed and unobserved cases. Let's start with his claim that there is no demonstrative or a priori reasoning that can convince us that the same causal relationships hold in observed as in unobserved cases. And his argument basically goes like this. If there were an a priori argument, if there is an a priori argument for any given proposition, then the negation of that proposition is inconceivable. Let me explain what he means by that. An a priori argument is one that doesn't depend on experience, on observation of the external world. And again, our examples of this, our paradigmatic illustrations, would be mathematics. You don't have to observe anything about the external world to know that 2 + 2 = 4. And Hume wants to say, yeah, when you've got a case like that, the falsity of the claim is inconceivable. Can you conceive of 2 + 2 = 5 or equaling anything but 4? Of 2 + 2 not equaling 4? He says, no, you can't. You got an a priori argument for that proposition. That's why its negation is inconceivable. Or for example, can you even conceive of a case where the Pythagorean theorem doesn't hold for a triangle? He would say, no, you can't. Can you even conceive of a case where bachelors are married men? No, he says, you can't. So he says those are the only kinds of cases where you can make an a priori argument. It's where the opposite is inconceivable. But he says, it is conceivable that unobserved events do not resemble observed events. For example, you can imagine, you can conceive of an object that doesn't fall towards the Earth at 9.86 meters per second squared gravitational acceleration rate. You could conceive of an object in free fall that actually just floated upwards through the air and spelled out your name in the sky, right? You may, it just takes a little bit of imagination, but it's certainly conceivable. There's no contradiction involved with that. It's not like trying to conceive of a four-sided triangle. And therefore, he wants to say, there is no a priori argument for the claim that unobserved events are going to resemble observed events, that the instances that we haven't seen are going to have to work the same way as instances that we have seen. So that's why he says there's no demonstrative argument for the uniformity of causal relationships. Well, maybe we don't need demonstrative arguments, right? Maybe we'll be fine with just a probabilistic argument. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. So just to give another example here of what he's saying, even after I've observed that fire plus gunpowder equals explosion in a million instances, it's still perfectly conceivable that the next time I put the torch to a keg of gunpowder, it's not going to explode. In other words, there's no valid deductive argument from the premise that in a million cases, fire plus gunpowder has caused an explosion, to the conclusion that in all cases, fire plus gunpowder causes explosions. That's not a valid argument. So you might think, well, that's okay. I don't need a valid deductive argument from that premise to that conclusion. I'll settle for a good probabilistic argument. There's an awesome inductive probabilistic argument from that premise to that conclusion. Great. Well, Hume thinks you're wrong. Here's why. Here's his basic idea. In all observed instances in the past, you might think, some certain kind of event, lighting gunpowder, has caused event Y, like an explosion. And you might think that that gives you an awesome inductive case for concluding that therefore, in future cases, X will cause Y, always. So that you can conclude from past observation to all cases whatsoever. But Hume says, wait a minute, when you make that move from past observation to future cases, you are making an assumption, which is necessary in order to make this a good argument. And that assumption is the uniformity principle. The uniformity principle is the principle that says unobserved future events resemble observed past events. Or even more generally, unobserved events resemble observed events. Hume says, look, all reasoning from past experience to unobserved events, all probabilistic arguments, that is, depends upon the assumption of the uniformity principle. But the big question is this: do we have any basis for believing that uniformity principle? If we don't, then the key premise, the key assumption that underlies all probabilistic arguments is unjustified, and all those kinds of arguments collapse. So what justification, what argument, what basis do we have for believing the uniformity principle? How do we know it's true? You might think, well, there's good inductive arguments for the truth of the uniformity principle. Really? Are there? Hume wants to say no. Here's why. Here's how his argument goes. All inductive arguments, he calls them experimental, but all inductive arguments have as a premise the claim that unobserved events resemble observed events. Right? That's the uniformity principle. But no good argument has its conclusion as one of its premises. That's called begging the question. And there's a circularity involved when you just assume your conclusion in order to prove that conclusion. So no good inductive argument can conclude that unobserved events resemble observed events. All such inductive arguments would be assuming the very conclusion that they intend to prove, right? Let's try to imagine how an inductive argument for the uniformity principle would go, okay? So if you want to make an inductive argument, you'd say, look, in all my past observations, the uniformity principle has always proven true. The world's never freaked out on me. It's not like the nature of gravity has ever changed on me after I'd observed it a million times. Nothing that I've observed a million times has ever turned out then to be false later. So therefore, that's really good grounds for thinking the uniformity principle is always true. It's true universally. But again, what are you assuming when you infer from past observations that therefore something is true always? You're assuming that unobserved events resemble the ones you have observed. And you might think, okay, fine. Yeah, you're right. I'm assuming that, but what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with it is this. Premise two just is the uniformity principle. The uniformity principle is a premise in the argument that is supposed to prove the uniformity principle. That makes this a circular or a question-begging argument. You're saying the uniformity principle is true, and I know this because the uniformity principle is true. That is not a good argument. All inductive arguments in support of the uniformity principle itself are therefore circular. That is David Hume's great insight. Well, what do we do with that? Now, where does this leave us? Here's where it leaves us. There's no good argument for the uniformity principle. If there's no good argument from the uniformity principle, inductive arguments are not justified, it seems. They're just going off a wish and a hope that things work the same when we're not looking as when we are. But there's no good argument to support that key assumption. There goes all ordinary life. There goes all scientific conclusions. There goes everything. The world outside of my present observations and memories is melting down all around me. This is, as a current textbook continues to list it, the mother of all problems for the philosophy of science. All from our friend David Hume. What was David Hume's solution? Did he just give up on life at this point? No, he said, I've got a skeptical solution of these doubts. Now that's a puzzling phrase. If it's skeptical, then how's it a solution? Wouldn't a solution eliminate the skepticism? Huh, what is going on there? Well, here's what's going on. He says it's custom, or we might say habit, psychological habit, not argument, that makes us believe in the uniformity principle, that makes us believe that the same causal relations that we've observed in the past are going to hold in unobserved cases. So custom or habit is the ultimate basis for our belief in any unobserved, unremembered matter of fact, including all of science. And you might think, wait a second, that's the solution? Well, it's at least an explanation of why we keep on holding these kinds of beliefs. But is it a justification for holding these beliefs? His solution raises the question, is custom or habit an intellectually credible basis for believing things? Are my habitual beliefs justified? Are they? Really good question. If not, what do we do with inductive inference? Here's the big picture. Here's what Hume is saying. How do we know how do we know any given unobserved matter of fact? Say that there's going to be an explosion. Well, because I know the causal relationship between a fact that I am observing, there's gunpowder being lit, and an unobserved matter of fact, the explosion that's going to happen. Well, how do I know what that causal relationship is? Because I've seen the same thing happen in similar cases a million times. Next question, how do I know that the unobserved causal relationship that hasn't happened yet is going to work the same way as those past causal relationships that I have observed? Hume's answer, there's no possible argument whatsoever that assures you of that, or even makes it probable. In fact, it's only psychological habit that makes you believe that. And here are the questions that all of this raises for us. First of all, Hume assumes that in our past experience, the uniformity principle has always held true. But you might ask, has it always held true in your past experience? Have you ever seen something that went completely contrary to your past observations and expectations? Second question for you, is Hume correct that all reasoning from past experience to unobserved events does depend on this assumption of the uniformity principle? If not, how do we make that inference? Final question. Let's say that you observe a chair levitate or a dead person come alive again. Would that make you conclude that the uniformity principle is false? If you did conclude that the uniformity principle is false, would you conclude that the world is simply completely chaotic or unpredictable? Things to think about. Hope you find the answers.